For most of modern history, inequality was treated like bad weather. Unpleasant, sometimes dangerous, but ultimately natural. Something markets would eventually smooth out over time. Something economic growth would fix. As long as the economy kept expanding, it wasn't considered something worth obsessing over. Then one economist did something surprisingly simple. He stopped looking at decades and started looking at centuries. Welcome to Financial Historian, the place where money, power, and history collide, and where nothing is ever as simple as it first appears. This is the story of Thomas Piketty and how his work quietly challenged one of the most comfortable assumptions in modern economics, the idea that capitalism naturally spreads wealth over time. This isn't a story about ideology. It's not about left versus right. It's about what happens when you follow the data long enough that the usual explanations start to fall apart. For most of the 20th century, mainstream economics focused on growth, productivity, output, and efficiency. The idea was simple: if the pie gets bigger, eventually everyone gets a larger slice. Inequality, if it showed up at all, was usually seen as temporary, a stage of development, a side effect of progress, or even a measurement issue that would correct itself over time. And for a while, history seemed to support that view. After World War II, inequality dropped sharply across much of Europe and the United States. Wages rose, the middle class expanded, home ownership increased, and wealth concentration visibly declined. Economists looked at this period and quietly assumed this was normal, the natural outcome of advanced capitalism doing what it does best. But that assumption rested on a very short memory. Piketty's insight wasn't philosophical. It was archival. Instead of starting with theories, he started with records, tax archives, government data, income statistics, and national accounts. And not just from one country or one era, but from multiple countries going back hundreds of years. When all that data was pieced together, a very different picture emerged. The post-war era wasn't the rule. It was the exception. For most of modern history, wealth has been far more concentrated than economists were comfortable admitting. The 19th century, the era of Jane Austen novels and rapid industrial expansion, wasn't a story of rising opportunity. It was a world dominated by inherited wealth, where owning capital mattered far more than working. The sharp drop in inequality after 1914 didn't happen because markets suddenly became fair. It happened because capital was destroyed. Wars wiped out fortunes. Inflation erased debts. Taxes rose dramatically. Governments intervened on a massive scale. Equality didn't arrive politely. It arrived violently. And once those forces faded, inequality slowly started doing what it had always done before: rising again. This is where Piketty's central question comes in, the one that made people uncomfortable. Why does wealth tend to concentrate over time, even in democratic market economies? This wasn't a moral question. It was a mechanical one. To answer it, Piketty made an important distinction: the difference between labor and capital. Labor is what you earn by working, wages and salaries. Income directly tied to your effort and time. Capital is what you own. Land, housing, stocks, businesses, and bonds. Assets that generate income simply by existing. And here's the quiet imbalance at the heart of the system. Labor has limits. You can only work so many hours in a day. Productivity can only increase so fast. Your income rises slowly, if it rises at all. Capital doesn't face those limits. Capital compounds. It doesn't need to work harder next year. It doesn't need to negotiate, retrain, or show up on time. It just needs to exist. This is where Piketty's most famous idea appears: when the average return on capital stays higher than the overall growth rate of the economy, wealth accumulated in the past grows faster than income earned in the present. That may sound technical, but the reality is simple. If you already own assets, your wealth tends to grow faster than the economy itself. If you don't, you're trying to catch something that's slowly accelerating away from you. This isn't a conspiracy. It's arithmetic. And over long enough periods of time, arithmetic usually wins. Piketty showed that this dynamic wasn't theoretical. It has appeared again and again across countries in centuries. Before the 20th century, inherited wealth dominated economic life. After the shocks of wars and large policy changes, inequality fell. But once growth slowed and capital recovered, the old pattern slowly returned. That's why his book Capital in the 21st Century caused such a stir when it was published. Because it quietly challenged one of the core stories modern societies tell themselves, that inequality is mostly about effort, skill, or merit, and that markets naturally reward contribution more than ownership. Piketty wasn't arguing that markets don't create wealth. He was showing that markets are extremely good at preserving and expanding existing wealth. When economic growth is high, wages can rise along with capital. But when growth slows down, capital keeps earning while labor becomes quieter. You can see the effects everywhere. Rising housing prices benefit homeowners, not renters. Stock market gains reward those who already own assets. Inheritance becomes more important. Opportunities become less about talent and more about timing, specifically whether you were born before or after assets became expensive. Compound interest doesn't care how hard you work. The real value of Piketty's work isn't just in the policies people debate. It's in the perspective it forces us to adopt. When you zoom out far enough, inequality stops looking like a failure of individuals. Instead, it starts to look like a feature of how capital behaves when left to itself. History may not repeat exactly, but capital definitely has habits. And one of its strongest habits is accumulation. Left uninterrupted, wealth tends to gather where it already exists. That outcome isn't morally inevitable, but mechanically, it's very likely. Policies can change. Shocks can reshape the system. But none of that happens by accident. The real lesson here is simple. Understanding inequality isn't about resentment or ideology. It's about realism. It's about seeing the financial system clearly enough to navigate it without illusions. Because if you mistake a structural tendency for a temporary phase, you don't just misunderstand history. You misunderstand risk. And if this gave you a new perspective, don't forget to subscribe.